Welcome to the 15-Minute Financial Feast podcast, bringing you 15-minute segments to help you retire with purpose on time. We're serving up food for thought and bread for the head. Are you hungry to learn? Here are your hosts, Mark Triplett and Troy Westendorf.
During this episode of the 15-Minute Financial Feast podcast, we're listening in on Troy Westendorf and Mark Triplett's Lunch and Learn series, where they covered a wide variety of retirement and tax planning strategies to help you retire with purpose on time.
Hey everyone, I hope you're having a great week so far. We're excited to share with you this week. Our 15-minute financial feast topic is all about you just received notice that you are receiving an inheritance. What should you do? And we're going to cover three things. How are different forms of inheritance received? What are the tax liabilities associated with pre-tax accounts like IRAs, 401ks? And what should you know about inheriting after-tax accounts and other property? So, Troy, let's get started there.
Yeah, so receiving inheritance is often complicated. Number one, it's confusing. There's several different variant processes that we have to go through. The paperwork can be often overwhelming. Emotions are usually high. You're usually accepting this from a loved one or a relative or a close friend. Tax consequences usually come into play. So there's a lot of different things pulling you in different directions, and usually your state of mind is not where it needs to be when it comes to making these decisions.
Yeah, I think you hit on something. It is emotional, and I think it's important to stop and just realize that somebody cared enough about you to leave some of their worldly possessions behind to you. And if you rush into this, because each type of potential inheritance has its own process of actually inheriting that, different paperwork associated, whether it's a financial institution you're working with or whether it's transferring of deeds on property and things like that. There are so many different processes for each of those different types of assets that it can become really, really confusing and overwhelming, especially if you're already kind of emotional because of the loss of a loved one. So it's really important just to slow down and know the rules, because an irrevocable mistake could result in unnecessary taxes, or just as worse, in my opinion, is the forfeiture of particular provisions that you might have available to you that if you don't know about them and you make a move, you could forfeit those potential privileges. So just take your time and understand the rules and understand your rights when it comes to receiving that inheritance.
I would say too, Mark, there's going to be people that are going to say, yeah, I'm ready for this, or I'm prepared. I would say go back and double check, because I went through some with close family that thought they were prepared, and it was still a process. So it wasn't like everything's in order. It was still
process.
And they thought things were pretty good.
You're talking about somebody preparing to leave assets behind to somebody.
Yeah, thinking they got everything in line, and for the person receiving it.
Yeah. So in that regard, even if your, let's say your parents who you're anticipating are going to leave assets to you are very well organized and put together and say, hey, we've got everything well organized. Maybe they do. Maybe it's not as well organized as what they thought. So usually our experience is when somebody inherits assets, they are pretty overwhelmed and confused, and they're coming to us and saying, hey, can you help me sort through all of this? So, and that's really what we're going to touch on today is as you're receiving those inheritance, you've been notified, what actions should you take and what should you be aware of? But it's also important for folks who are preparing for wealth transfer of assets that they're not going to need throughout their retirement to listen to this as well, because it may impact how they arrange things for their loved ones.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about just inheritance coming in different forms. Right. Okay. So there are different asset types, and there are different ways to inherit different assets depending on how it was set up prior to the passing of that individual.
Yes, you have transfer on death accounts. That can be bank accounts, brokerage accounts. You have named beneficiaries. Maybe it's a certain asset that you listed as beneficiary that's coming to you. You have the legal side of it. Maybe it's in a trust, maybe it's in a will. So there's several different aspects on how things are left. as far as an inheritance. So it does come in many different forms.
Yeah, and each one of these has its own set of rules and privileges. I mean, if you talk about, like, for example, let's say your grandfather passes and leaves you to pre-tax accounts, IRAs or something like that.
Yep.
Well, there's one set of rules and privileges that you need to be aware of when you receive those dollars. But what if he has a classic Corvette sitting in the garage? And it's not, there's no transfer on death on that. Maybe you're listed in the will as receiving that. Maybe it was set aside in a trust. Maybe not. Maybe it has to go through the estate settling process, and it can be complicated and messy. So all of these different types of assets, from financial institution accounts, bank accounts, brokerage accounts, qualified plans, pre-tax, IRAs, 401ks that are used the IRS, life insurance proceeds, variable annuities. I mean, you run the whole gamut of all kinds of different assets and property that somebody could leave behind. They all have their own sets of rules and privileges when it comes to how you receive those. And an irrevocable decision could be quite costly if you make a wrong move. So I think it's again, slow down. The choices you make can often impact the tax benefits or loss of those tax benefits if you make a wrong move. So just slow down and understand the difference between receiving IRAs versus 401ks, because there are different provisions there. What happens on a transfer on death account versus maybe something that has to go through the estate settling process? Or what's the difference in inheriting a Roth IRA versus a traditional IRA? All of these little nuances do matter, and it makes a difference. So let's talk about what should you know when you're inheriting pre-tax money. So we're talking about IRAs, 401ks, other IOUs to the IRS. So what should we know when we're receiving pre-tax accounts?
Right. So there's eligible designated beneficiaries. So they still allow the stretch over their lifetime. We'll talk a little bit more about the stretch IRA, but we're talking about a surviving spouse. So you can do that over your lifetime. A disability person, terminally ill, minor child, and no more than 10 years younger than the descendant. So you want to touch a little bit on that, what that actually means?
Yeah, so let's just break this down. So prior to the Secure Act of 2019, which passed in December of 2019, went in effect January 1st of 2020, like that,
Yeah.
right? Very little runway to make adjustments. The Secure Act changed, or really, I shouldn't say changed. It created a second set of designated beneficiaries. So it limited certain eligible designated beneficiaries. Prior to the Secure Act, anybody could, quote, stretch their inherited IRA, meaning if you received an IRA prior to December 31st of 2019, if you received an IRA from a loved one as an inherited IRA, you were allowed to stretch that over your lifetime, meaning you had to take required minimum distributions, but you didn't have to distribute that over a certain period of time. You could maintain that tax deferral for as long as you wanted to. You could make more frequent distributions if you felt like it, but you weren't required to distribute it over a certain period of time, but you had to take required minimum distributions. The Secure Act changed that for most folks. It created a new 10-year rule that applies to most beneficiaries inheriting an IRA,
Right.
except for what is known as an eligible designated beneficiary. An eligible designated beneficiary is able to stretch just like you were prior to the Secure Act being passed. But those are limited to, as you mentioned, surviving spouse.
Yep.
That one that I think is really interesting is the no more than 10 years younger. So let's say, if your parent leaves you an IRA, you're going to be more than 10 years younger than them. So you're going to have a 10-year rule apply to you. But what if your brother passes, didn't have any kids, and leaves an IRA to you, and you guys were 6 years apart? Well, you are actually eligible to stretch that IRA. You do not have to distribute that IRA over a 10-year period of time.
Nice.
You can still stretch because you're less than 10 years younger. Most folks, however, when they inherit an IRA, are going to fall under this new 10-year rule that was established under the Secure Act. And the 10-year rule applies to all other beneficiaries that are designated beneficiaries, requiring you to distribute the entire account that you inherit over a 10-year period, with the first year beginning the year after death. So, for example, we have somebody who passes away today. Okay, so let's say your father passes away today, leaves you an IRA. your 10-year period starts in 2022, and you must distribute all of the assets in that inherited IRA by the end of the 10th year, beginning in 2022. So you technically have, well, we're in March, right, at this point.
Yeah.
So you would technically have all of the rest of this year, and then beginning in 2022, that would be when your 10-year window starts, and you have to distribute it. There's no required minimum distribution other than it must all be liquidated by the end of the 10th year. Now, this can cause a problem because those pre-tax distributions can actually impact a lot of different well, there are a lot of different scenarios where that can come into play. I'm just going to read a few of them out of our article that we posted on our website titled, "You Just Received Notice of an Inheritance. What Should You Do?" Same title as this podcast. So the impact from those pre-tax distributions, they may increase your effective tax rate, right? When you distribute these pre-tax dollars, whether you do it all at one time or you spread it out somehow over 10 years, those are going to impact your taxable income because they get layered on top of your earned income from your employment. That can impact your college-bound child's ability to qualify for financial aid. If you're actually retired and you're on Medicare and you receive an inheritance from a pre-tax account, that could impact your Medicare premiums, right? If it pushes your adjusted gross income, your AGI, above a certain threshold, then all of a sudden you might have to pay higher Medicare premiums because of the income-related monthly adjustment amount, or IRMA. In addition to that, it can impact your provisional income, which provisional income is what determines whether your Social Security benefits are taxed. So receiving inherited IRA dollars or 401ks or other pre-tax accounts can have a significant impact on the rest of your financial picture. And frankly, it can complicate things pretty dramatically. So you really have to understand how and when to receive that as a non-eligible designated beneficiary under the 10-year rule. Now, let's talk about Roth IRAs for a moment, because that's completely different, right? When I inherit a Roth IRA, it is still considered a pre-tax account, but I have to distribute it over 10 years under the new 10-year rule, but it's all tax-free, right? A Roth IRA that you inherit from someone is completely tax-free because Roths are never taxed accounts versus an IRA, which is a forever taxed account. So when you inherit that Roth IRA, you don't have to pay taxes on it.
Right.
But you still have to distribute it within that 10-year period following the year of death. So why not just distribute it all right away, right? Let's say if I have a $200,000 Roth IRA that I inherit from my parent, and why wouldn't I just take it out? It's not going to affect me in any way, shape, or form in taxes, right?
Right.
$200,000, I distribute it, it's tax-free. Now I can invest it and do whatever I want. Well, here's the catch. Why would you want to forego your privilege to defer that Roth account for another 10 years? Imagine you have this account and you invest it and you earn 7%. Rule of 72 says that at 7%, it's going to approximately double. So 200,000 becomes 400,000. If I take that $200,000 and I invest that and I keep it in a Roth status for 10 years, now I've grown from 200,000 to 400,000 tax-free. If I distribute that IRA when I get it, that Roth IRA, when I get it, I don't have to pay taxes on it. I have $200,000. I go invest that in an after-tax account, and it grows to $400,000 over a 10-year period at 7%. But now I have $200,000 of long-term capital gains, assuming I've held those investments longer than 12 months, that I wouldn't have had if I kept it in that Roth IRA wrapper for that period of time. So you can see how you can quickly make a mistake by not understanding the rules and just snapping to judgment and doing an irrevocable maneuver that can cost you significantly when it comes to missed opportunities to take advantage of some of these privileges. So just slow down. We're going to hear that again and again.
Yeah, slow down is a big one. And so when we talk a little bit more about the inheriting the after-tax assets, and that would come down to more like a probably best case scenario when you think of it as a home, or maybe mom and dad owned a lake home and let's say they pay $100,000 for this lake home 30 years ago. It's developed. The lake is beautiful now. There's homes around it. And now let's just say the value is $500,000. Mom and dad pass. What happens when we inherited the cabin now? How does that tax?
So they paid $100,000 for it. It's worth $500,000 now. It's $400,000 worth of long-term capital gains if they sold it while they were alive. But because they left it, passed away with it, and was left to their beneficiaries, you in this case,
Yep.
then in that situation, you do not have to pay taxes on that $400,000 of capital gains. You get what is called a stepped up basis. The market value is $500,000 today. At their passing, you inherit it. It's now $500,000 is your stepped up basis. Now, the Biden tax plan is considering doing away with this, particularly for high income earners. So we're going to pay really close attention to what's going to happen with the state of stepped up basis going forward. But right now, when you inherit property like real estate, that could be your childhood home or a vacation property that your parents own. It could be stocks, bonds, mutual funds, other types of property in an after-tax brokerage account. When you receive that, it's very important that you understand you should be getting a step up in basis. And the financial institutions are supposed to recognize this and do it, but they don't always do it. In fact, very, very often we find folks inherit an account that is an after-tax account. By the time we get the statements in our hands, we identify the fact that the financial institution didn't step up the cost basis. And so they could end up paying unnecessary taxes if they liquidate assets and distribute to themselves because the financial institution didn't track it properly. And it's kind of up to you to be aware of that. So just, again, slow down and make sure that you're taking advantage of this. The last thing I think we should really touch on are just what are the things you should do when you've been notified that you are going to be receiving an inheritance. Number one on that list is, we've said it before, slow down. It's emotional. There's no rush. Take your time and get organized. Gather all of the necessary documents.
Yeah.
Right. Gather all of the information regarding the claim forms. If it's a financial institution, get all the claim forms for the financial institution. Get multiple copies of the death certificate, because each financial institution might require a copy, an actual copy of the death certificate.
Yeah, they will need the original copy. Yep. Can't do a photocopy.
Yep. Gather all the estate documents that you have access to. Gather all of that information. Again, slow down. Now, step number two, carefully evaluate how to receive the proceeds of the various account types and the various asset types. So you might want to take a Roth IRA as an inherited IRA. You might want to take an after-tax brokerage account with a stepped-up basis, and it's a completely different manner. You're going to receive that property from your parents in a different way, but you want to make sure that that's stepped up. And maybe there's multiple beneficiaries because you have brothers and sisters, and something has to be sold, like a piece of property, liquidated before you can each have your share of the cash. Or you decide to keep the property, and now you might want to set up an LLC, and everybody pays in to pay for the cost of maintenance. So it can get complicated really quick. Gather the documents, slow the heck down. There's no rush, and seek the advice of somebody who's been down this path before. If you don't have an advisor that's been down this path before, doesn't know how to handle this, seek somebody who can help you walk through these different steps and make sure that you're organized and you understand your rights as somebody inheriting those assets, so you don't make an irrevocable mistake and pay more in taxes than are necessary, or miss out on those privileges that you would have otherwise had had you not made that mistake. So that's it for this week's show. If you have questions about this topic today, or if you have questions about an inheritance that you have received in the past or you think you're going to be receiving, you can hit us up at www.mypt5.com. That's www.mypt5.com, or call our office and schedule some time to speak with one of us. And just remember that every dollar has a purpose.
And every dollar has a timeline.
And be sure that you're taking steps to retire with purpose on time. See you later.
Next time. See you guys.
You've been listening to the 15-Minute Financial Feast podcast. Remember, every dollar has a purpose and every dollar has a timeline. If you have questions about today's topic, schedule a call with a team member. Visit www.mypt5.com. Until next time, be sure you're taking steps to retire with purpose on time. Mark Triplett is an investment advisor representative of and advisory services offered through Royal Fund Management, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Nothing contained in this program should be considered an offer to buy or sell securities. Different investments have different risks associated with them, and not all investments are appropriate for all investors.